Good morning to those watching in the United States. Good afternoon in Europe. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the Senior Director for the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. I'm really delighted to welcome you all for this event on European security, presenting the EU Strategic Compass, the strategic document on foreign policy and defense released by the European Union, what that means for EU-US defense cooperation, with two fantastic speakers today. Ambassador Charles Fries from Brussels, the Deputy Secretary General for Common Security and Defense Policy and Crisis Response at the European External Action Service, and Molly Montgomery, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the US State Department. This conversation will be moderated by our senior fellow here at the Europe Center, Damir Marusik. We at the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council have always believed that a strong EU raising its ambition on defense and strategic issues is an asset for the transatlantic relationship and NATO. And this is why we've put the EU so much at the core of our work over the last few years, and have been honored to welcome its leaders, such as President von der Leyen or the High Representative Joseph Borrell. I would want to greet Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, who is in the room with us today in Washington, D.C., who has been a strong friend of the Atlantic Council over the last few years. So this conversation would have been timely, I think, at any moment. But of course, it's especially critical right now, as we're seeing the consequences of the dramatic aggression against Ukraine by Russia, with new revelations coming just in the last couple of days on the atrocities committed in Bucha and other places all around Ukraine. In the last months, we've seen unprecedented cooperation between both sides of the Atlantic in supporting Ukraine by sending weapons, in increasing the cost of aggression on the regime of Vladimir Putin with massive economic sanctions. And I'm sure we'll talk about what that means also for transatlantic cooperation in the long term. We've seen a new trend in rearmament coming from Europe, with countries such as Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Poland making historic decisions on increased defense spending. All of this, I think, is a really important step towards a stronger transatlantic cooperation and stronger EU on the world stage, and this is what we'll be talking about. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and now I'll turn to Damir Marusik, our senior fellow, who will be moderating this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Welcome to everyone joining us here. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. I'd like to encourage you to think of some questions. We'll do a round with our guests very quickly to sort of get the conversation going. But please use Zoom's Q&A feature, and my colleagues will feed the questions to me so we can keep this as an interactive session. Welcome. We're really honored to have both of you here with us. Ambassador Fries, let me start with a question to you. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest takeaways and priorities from the EU's strategic compass? It's been a document that's been in the making for quite some time, but now with the Ukraine war happening, it has, as Ben mentioned, has a new kind of significance. EU's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, said that the EU needs to learn the language of power. Are you satisfied with the document as it stands? Is it up to the current moment?
Thank you. First, I'm very glad to join this Atlantic Council meeting. As you said, Damir, I think it's an important document which was adopted precisely 2 weeks ago by the 27 EU member states. It's the first time in the EU's history that the EU, the member states, have decided to define together what they want to do in the area of security and defense. It's the first time. A common document, a long document, a strategic document, and it's important because the work started two years ago, and the objective was to define a common assessment of the threats and challenges that Europe is facing. So, and that was based on an analysis which was done 2 years ago by the intelligence community of the 27 member states. And based on that, we define together common objectives, how we can be a better security provider, how we could boost our capacity to act more robustly and more efficiently when a crisis happens, to how we can protect more the EU and its citizens, how we can invest more and better together in defense, and how we can also strengthen our partnerships, particularly with NATO and with the US. So I think this document, it's the objective of this document is to is that we want as EU to become a stronger security provider, and we see that in the current crisis, we of course we need to meet to respond to the current challenges. But I would like to say that there are some elements of response to what's happening right now in Ukraine in this document. But I would like to insist on the fact that the strategic document, the work on it started much before the invasion and has a much broader horizon of time, because it's a document for the next 5 to 10 years. And also the document is not focused on what's happening in the eastern side of Europe. It covers also the situation in the Western Balkans, in Africa, in Indo-Pacific, in the wider Middle East. So, and we are covering all kind of threats, not only the conventional threats, as we see now in the Ukraine with tanks and planes and helicopters used by Russia, but also all kind of threats, hybrid threats, cyber attacks, disinformation. What's happening also what we should do in order to secure our maritime security. Also what we have to do in the space, because space is now a much more contested area than before. So this document, it's a coincidence, but this document, the elaboration started before, but we have beefed up, we have boosted the language in the compass, because of course we have taken into account what has happened in Ukraine.
Thank you. Ms. Montgomery, I guess a similar question to you, but from the U.S. perspective. And again, Ambassador Fries talked about the importance of cooperation and transatlantic partnership. What would you say that the strategic compass, from the perspective of the United States, what does it mean, and what does it look like from here in Washington?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks to everyone who's joined for this really important and timely discussion. I would say that from the beginning of the Biden administration, we have really been looking to increase the level of ambition in our partnership with the EU. And that is in line as well with President von der Leyen's her own ambitions to have a more geopolitical EU, as you said, one that is feeling its power. And so I think the strategic compass couldn't come at a more appropriate time, given the geopolitical moment, certainly, but also because we have parallel processes happening both here in the United States and in NATO, where we will be finalizing a strategic concept over the next few months. And so this is really an opportunity for us to all ensure that our threat perception is accurate to the current moment, that we are knitting together ways that we can work together to increase our capabilities, to address the threats that we face, not just from Russia, but obviously from the PRC, from other challenges and sources of instability around the world. And so we really view the strategic compass as an excellent starting point for that discussion. We will be launching our security and defense dialogue with the EU later this month, and certainly implementation of the strategic compass and discussions of our planned national security strategy will be high on the agenda, as well, of course, as conversations about what is happening in Ukraine, but also just the cooperation that we continue to grow between the United States and Europe in the field of security and defense, whether that's on military mobility, other sources of cooperation in the capabilities development field as well.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Fries, Ms. Montgomery just mentioned the NATO's strategic concept that's going to be developed. There's a big focus about non-duplication, which actually has been very much a an area of concern in Washington historically, and it has been something that the EU has been, I think, very careful to address. Can you speak how the EU views the development in parallel with NATO at this point? And as you were writing the strategic compass, how did you keep NATO in mind?
We have always kept NATO in mind, and in the strategic compass, it's clearly mentioned that we have a strategic partnership with NATO, and that, of course, NATO is key for the collective defense for all the members who are also members of the alliance, and that's obvious that what we have been doing in the compass, it's something which will also, from our point of view, will strengthen NATO. And I would like to thank Molly Montgomery for what she has said about the adoption of this document. We consider that beyond what we have been doing for ourselves, we think that this document is also very good news for the US and for the transatlantic relationship. And Molly has said that very clearly, because first we appreciate the fact that we can work a lot and in a very confident spirit with the current US administration, and we appreciate the fact that the US have understood and recognized that a more capable EU, a stronger EU in the area of security and defense will contribute positively to transatlantic and global security, and in full complementarity with NATO. So that must be clear, and because I think that the more the EU member states cooperate, invest, spend in defense, the more reliable we become for the US. Because also it's good news for the burden sharing. It's something that has been requested by the US for many, many years, and we can understand this. And so the fact that now, particularly because of what's happening in Ukraine, we need to spend more in defense. Look at what Germany has announced. Look at what's going to happen in Denmark with this referendum. Look at the debate in Finland and Sweden. Everything now is put into question, but I would say in the positive way. So that's my first point. And second, we adopted the strategic compass in March, and NATO is going to adopt its strategic concept at the end of June in Madrid at the NATO summit. And we have, of course, we need to ensure the coherence, the complementarity between what the EU is doing and what NATO is doing. And so we consider, and there have been an excellent coordination. For instance, myself, I've been many times in NATO in order to explain what we wanted to do and to dispel possible misunderstandings and to insist on the fact that what we are doing it will be good, will be positive for NATO, because we have only one kind of capabilities. What we have what we call the single set of forces. We don't have EU capabilities. The capabilities are owned by the member states, which can deploy them for NATO, for the UN, or for the EU. And so when we try to be a stronger security provider, it's also good news for NATO. And so there will be at the end of June the adoption of the strategic concept, and I think to a certain extent what we have done with the strategic compass is a European contribution to the elaboration of the strategic concept.
Ms. Montgomery, do you have anything else to sort of add on that? How that's being perceived? Again, perfect cooperation. Any problems that you foresee going forward with this, or has it been smooth sailing so far?
So I would say that I think what Charles said is absolutely right in terms of just this being a big step forward in terms of our ability to work together, to have a common threat picture that we work from, and ideally it will contribute to stronger NATO-EU cooperation, because that will be critical, particularly as we look to increase defense spending, as we look at the role that the EU is playing, acting as a clearinghouse for contributions in terms of security assistance to Ukraine. And so it's more important than ever that we have that close cooperation. And so I think our hope certainly is that this will contribute to that. because we really do, as Charles said, support a stronger EU defense that is complementary to and interoperable with NATO. And so I think we look forward to, as I said before, this security and defense dialogue as really a way to ensure that we bilaterally between the US and the EU are moving that conversation forward.
So we have a question from Mark Zashin out on the internet, and you've partly answered it already, but let me also embellish it a little bit. He says, how does the EU defense mechanism objective act with or apart from the United States? So partly we have an answer to that already, but let me ask you, Ambassador, one of the things that is, I think is a tension perhaps, is this is an EU document, and it is the EU strategic compass. Do you see that the ownership of this is more in the Commission or in the Council? Is it the member states or is it the EU? And I think that maybe helps elucidate this kind of question of competencies vis-a-vis the United States. Can you maybe speak a little bit to that?
This document was proposed by the HRVP, so High Representative Vice President Mr. Borrell. He was the pen holder. And the elaboration of this document has been done in constant coordination with the European Commission and with the European Defence Agency. So that for the process, I would say, for the elaboration of the document, and also for the different drafts of the compass, because you can imagine that particularly at the end of the process, we had a lot to do in order to adapt the text. But at the end of the day, it's a member state document, and we have always said that it's a member state driven process. It must be a document owned by the member states, because why? Because at the end of the day, it's the member states who are going to implement it. You know, on defense, it's still, to a certain extent, it's an intergovernmental competence. And so the High Representative, who was a pen holder, now will be the guardian for the implementation, the watchkeeper. But he will push in order to check that the document is well implemented, but it depends on the member state. So when you say Commission, the Commission is on board, and we have put in the document a lot of very good and positive proposals of the Commission, particularly with the defense package which was proposed by the Commission 2 months ago, in order precisely to see how we can boost investment spending within the EU, and particularly in a collaborative manner. But so everybody is on board, and I would say it's a Team Europe product. Mm-hmm. And I'm very proud of the collective, on how the collective work has been done, and at the end, how the 27 member states, despite the divergences, despite the fact that, of course, Portugal doesn't have the same perception of the threats than Lithuania. Or Ireland doesn't have the same perception of the threat than Greece. But at the end, we managed to find a common way, and that's why also we consider that with the strategic concept, we have made a lot of progress in the elaboration of a common strategic culture, something which was really missing within the EU in the past.
Ms. Montgomery, President Biden has spent a lot of time actually investing in the relationship with the EU, and I know it's very early times, the document's just been released and we were just talking about NATO, but how is now, given what we were discussing earlier, the sort of reservations that the United States has had, in the Biden administration, do you have a sense of, as the ambassador just mentioned, this ownership is basically on the level of the member states. How do you foresee sort of cooperation going forward, especially on security matters, developing this in the future?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's really important that we remember that there are 23 common EU member states who are also NATO allies. And so, this is a little bit of playing three-dimensional chess when we engage with the EU. We always, of course, engage with the Commission, with the Council, but also with member states. And I think that's particularly important here because these are capabilities that belong to member states. And there is, as Charles said, one single set of forces that can be deployed, in any number of ways. Of course, for us, NATO remains the cornerstone of transatlantic security and defense. But I think this is really a cooperative process where we are engaging in a lot of detail with both the Commission and with member states as they go forward, particularly in this current moment, whether it's on security assistance, whether it's on raising defense spending, developing new capabilities, and really ensuring that the United States is also engaged in the fullest possible way in European defense initiatives so that we're able to move forward together in all of these areas.
Well, so one of the I guess headline announcements of the Strategic Compass was the establishment of a 5,000 troop strong EU Rapid Reaction Force. Ambassador Fries, can you speak to the value that this force will add, I think, in the medium term to immediate to medium term as it's established to European security? Perhaps even speaking in the shadow of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, how does that look like to you? What situations and what theaters do you envision this force being deployed?
Thank you. Thank you for this question, but because it's true that this EU rapid deployment capacity is one of the main deliverables of the strategic compass. What is the idea behind that? What we want is to allow the EU to act more rapidly and more robustly when a crisis is happening. And for this, we have created a capacity to act which could allow the deployment of up to 5,000 troops, it's true, and the objective is to set up this by 2025. So we have 3 years in order to create this capacity. What do we have in mind? We are going to work on scenarios which will be adopted before the end of the year, and we have two concrete examples in mind. First, to launch this force in order to rescue or evacuate EU citizens in a foreign country which could be in a turmoil. The second possibility is to have a stabilization mission in a non-permissive environment, so in a hostile environment. And so you can imagine, particularly, for instance, the situation in an African country which asks to be supported by an EU force, by this capacity, because it faces suddenly a terrorist destabilization operation or something equivalent. So the idea is to use what we have been created, what we created in the past, the famous battle groups. But we know that the battle groups, even if they have existed, they have never been deployed. So we want to change, to modify substantially the parameters of these battle groups, and we want also to pre-identify certain capacities which could be offered by member states, medical units, cyber units, amphibious capabilities. And so by adding the battle groups whose parameters will have been substantially modified and other capabilities, we think that by 2025 we will have the capacity to project such European force in order to be more reactive. But I would like to be very clear, it's not the EU rapid deployment capacity is not at all linked with collective defense. That's only for NATO, and this EU rapid deployment capacity will be a crisis management instrument. Second, it will not, you cannot compare this with the NATO response force or with the very high readiness joint task force. The size are not comparable. The VGTF, it's 20,000 people. The rapid deployment capacity is maximum 5,000. And once again, it's something for outside the EU. So I think there will be no duplication, but the idea is to use this capacity when the EU has its own interests at stake and when NATO is not involved. We don't want to do what NATO has to do, but it's obvious that in certain situations we have crises where NATO or the United States consider that it's not their business, but we as Europeans, we consider it's our own business. And that's why we need to create such capacity. And by creating scenarios, by exercising such capacities from next year, I think that in 3 years' time we will be ready and we will be a much more efficient security provider because of this new capacity.
Just to ask you a follow-up, because it's something that's well, I work on it a lot here, but it's the Western Balkans, for example. Do you envision, this being an area? Obviously, this is something where the U.S. and EU have cooperated, and obviously there's overlap between EU forces and NATO in Bosnia. But so is that, for example, sort of an area that would be the ideal?
Yes, you're right to mention that in Bosnia, it's the best example it's a flagship project of EU-NATO cooperation with the Altea operation, which has been in Bosnia now since 2004. But this could be a test case, Western Balkans. We have in mind also a situation in Africa, but Western Balkans could be used for that. It's sure.
Ms. Montgomery, we have a question from Sebastian Springer. It says, what topic areas do you foresee the EU-US defense dialogue tackling that aren't already covered by transatlantic fora? Will there be a specialization of topics?
So I would say, first of all, this will be a forum for us to have strategic conversations about things like the implementation of the strategic compass, our own national security strategy. So while we may do that in some of our engagements already, we don't have a dedicated forum. We also will be looking at things like our participation in European defense initiatives, looking at our respective defense industries and how we can facilitate greater coordination and openness, but also things like our security assistance and areas where we're both active, potentially in places like Africa, and making sure that we're deconflicting. So I think we're going to continue to develop the topics as we go, but this is really, I think, an exciting initiative in terms of having a dedicated forum for us to discuss these issues at a time when it has never been more important for us to have strong relationships with the EU and with member states. And I think, particularly as we look at the steps forward that the EU has taken that are really groundbreaking, particularly in terms of the use of the European peace facility to provide 1 billion euros worth of security assistance to Ukraine. That's clearly another area where we have a lot of conversation to be had as we both look to flow as much assistance as we can as quickly as possible to Ukraine.
So maybe a question for both of you, but I'll start with you, Ms. Montgomery. About the harmonizing procurement processes. Obviously, there have been a lot of commitments across member states now to really up their spending. How do you specifically see that? You mentioned this as part of perhaps this dialogue, the coordination. Is that going to be a difficult process to make sure? It seems like it's a very important one to make sure that, again, the duplication doesn't happen, that the money is spent well, and that capacities are met. Can you maybe say a few words about that before we hear from Ambassador Freed?
Absolutely. So I would say this is, it's a topic that gets very technical very quickly, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, except to say I think we've had some breakthroughs in the last year in that this administration has worked really hard along with the EU to begin negotiations on an administrative arrangement with the European Defense Agency that will allow us to participate once it's concluded, potentially in projects. We are already on track to participate in the PESCO military mobility project. So while, of course, these can be difficult topics and they get into questions of competition, industrial bases that have often been challenging in the past, I think having a forum to discuss these issues and really a commitment that we will work together as closely as possible, particularly in an area where it's, or in a time when it's so important for us to get the maximum value that we can for that increase in defense spending that we're seeing. It's really crucial that we just work together as constructively as possible.
Ambassador Freed, I mean, the same question to you, but maybe even to turn it a little bit. We spoke earlier between the roles between the member states and the Commission and on the sort of the EU level. Is there a role for the EU to maybe adjudicate between member states and sort of bridge with the United States to try and solve some of these very difficult issues?
We will see if we go in this direction, because this debate will take place in the coming months. As I said, the Commission has been tasked to elaborate an analysis of the defense investment gaps and to come up with some new proposals, particularly to see how we can boost joint procurement and joint development. So I don't want to prejudge the outcome of the debate. But I think the examples mentioned by Molly are very interesting, because we have made a lot of progress in the EU-US cooperation in the last years in the security and defense. The PESCO participation of the US to the PESCO project on military mobility, it's a clear illustration that this PESCO process, which is for the member states, in order to boost defense cooperation among member states, it's not something closed, and we are open to third state participation when we have each time a clear added value, which was obviously the case with military mobility. The fact that we have started now the negotiations for an administrative arrangement between the European Defence Agency and the United States, it's very positive. That was a long-standing request coming from Washington, and now we are doing that. And a new track of negotiation is planned in Washington in May. And the third point, I know that there was in the past some questions about this new instrument, which is called the European Defence Fund. Would that not be something closed and protectionist instruments? Sometimes we heard such criticism. But it's not the case. Of course, it's European taxpayer. It's the European taxpayer money. So you can understand then when you have European taxpayer money, it must be above all used for European companies and European projects. But it's an open instrument, and insist on that. And for instance, you have a pilot program before the implementation of the European Defence Fund, which was implemented at the end in 2019, 2020, and 6 US companies have been selected and have been benefiting from EU fund because they are members of European consortia involved in defense the project. So here again, I would like to underline that this our process, PESCO, EDF, EDA, we are open to strong cooperation with the United States. And that's why it's important to have the first meeting of the EU-US dialogue, which will take place at the end of the month in Brussels. The dialogue was officially launched last December, and now the first meeting will take place in 3 weeks. That's very positive. In full complementarity, of course, with what represents NATO. But I think it's very positive for us to see that the US have understood that when we are talking about European security issues, and when they come to Brussels, it's very important, of course, that obvious that they have first to go to NATO, but also that they have to talk directly to us. And I think I really thank the Molly and all the team and all the US authorities who have seen that what we are doing is an asset, is something positive for the transatlantic security. And if I may also say something about the investment spending, because you mentioned the collaborative issue. It's, of course, for us very important. We want to spend more, but above all, we want to spend better. And it's true that we have seen over the last years an increase in Europe of defense spending, but unfortunately a decrease of in the way the defense procurement are made. And for instance, today, in 2020, we only 11% of the defense procurement in Europe, in the EU, were made in a collaborative way. That means through a European project. That means that's something that we would like to change, because the benchmark, which has been fixed by the European Defence Agency, is that we should have 35% of defense procurement made in a collaborative way. So 11%, 35%. So we are very far below. And that's why we would like now to change the current situation, and that's why we are eager to see the analysis of the Commission and the proposals made in coordination with the EDA, because we have to change this current situation in order to have economies of scales and also to reduce the current fragmentation of our defense market in Europe, which is really a big problem. In the States, you have one main battle tank. In Europe, you have 17 different types of battle tanks. It's ridiculous. we have to put an end to such a situation.
Given the crisis in Ukraine, then, and obviously, as you said at the beginning, the strategic compass is much broader and not tied to this. But in the sense of the EU and member states becoming closer partners for NATO, for both of you, this is a question, but perhaps Ambassador Fries first, if you could talk about what capabilities do you think that the EU EU member states need to develop, again, in the medium term right now, to be able to guarantee a new kind of European security in the shadow of Ukraine? And then I'll turn to you, Molly, to ask you basically about where would you like to see the EU basically spend and concentrate?
Yes. So I think the capabilities that we need following the current crisis, of course, are the same capabilities that we will need in the NATO context, because here it's an issue of a very it's a war linked to a high-end situation. I mean, we are in the high-end spectrum. And so we need to develop a lot of capabilities, and that's why the Commission will carry out this analysis in order precisely to identify the areas where we have some gaps, and but we have already done a large part of the work, because we have the European Defence Agency. We have a lot of process already made at the EU level. We have a capability development plan. We have a coordinated annual review on defense. We have the PESCO project. And so all this has allowed us to identify the strategic enablers which we are still missing, and also the generation, independently of our CSDP missions and operations, also what we need in the medium and long-term perspective in terms of strategic priorities, strategic technologies. And in fact, the EDA and the member states of the EDA have adopted concrete areas where we should develop more our capabilities. So now the issue is not really what is missing, it's how we are going to fill the gap.
Ms. Montgomery, again, maybe to sharpen that question, budgets have just passed here, spending. Some of the criticism has been that if the United States is going to take China and Europe seriously, spending is going to have to go up. It may go up in future years as this happens. But then the pressure then becomes that still the United States is going to have to focus outside. And if there is a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, there's a question of how that will be filled. So if you'd say a few words about, again, what would be priorities from Washington's side that the EU would need to sort of fill in the, again, not necessarily immediate, but in the medium term?
Absolutely. Well, I would say, first of all, I think it's so important, just coming back to the strategic compass and the strategic concept, that we are orienting ourselves toward today's threats. Yeah. Because when you look at, in the NATO context, the last strategic concept was from 2010. And how much the world has changed, and how much that affects the capabilities that we need. So I think we're all having a rethink in terms of what it is that we actually need to focus on in terms of capabilities. Obviously, there is a need to streamline. There's a need to try and be as effective as possible with our spending. And we do want to see that the NATO planning process informs what member states do, or what allies do, and therefore what member states do. And that will be really important. We haven't talked a lot today about ensuring that we're ready to meet threats other than Russia. So certainly the PRC is one. We also look at emerging technologies, cyber, hybrid, et cetera. And so this isn't only going to be about tanks. This is also going to be about other capabilities. But I think it's excellent that we have these processes ongoing at the same time, in order to enable us to really approach this issue set from a common perspective, and work with all of these countries that are increasing their defense spending, really by groundbreaking amounts to ensure that we are developing all of those capabilities that we need to meet this moment.
Ambassador Fries, so that brings up a different question. You mentioned earlier, of course, that the EU is now also, committing to the Indo-Pacific. When we talk about sort of burden sharing, but also sort of responsibility sharing geographically, do you think that the EU should perhaps focus more on securing its own neighborhood as far as priorities, or do you see there's no real tension between focusing basically on nearer threats versus broader threats further afield?
You raised the question of what should be the geographical priorities for the EU, and I can tell you, of course, that was a big debate within the EU, because you have some member states who consider that their priorities should be only the neighborhood, and for the Eastern neighborhood, or the Western Balkans, or the North African neighborhood. And you have also some other member states saying, of course, it's important to tackle the challenges related to our neighborhood, but the EU is a global actor, is a global player. And if we want to be global, we need to think global. And that means that we need also to be involved in the whole African continent, and of course to be involved in the Indo-Pacific, because we know that the Indo-Pacific is now the area for the future of the main geopolitical developments. And so that's why the EU adopted last year in September a communication on what the EU wants to do with the Indo-Pacific, with a lot of concrete actions. And in the compass, this issue is also developed on the security and defense dimension. I would like, for instance, to mention the fact that recently the EU Council has decided to create a new maritime area of interest in the northwest part of the Indian Ocean, in order to have a better situational awareness of what's happening in this area, so between the Strait of Hormuz, Red Sea, Horn of Africa, and to try to develop the cooperation between EU member states, because it's a key area for the flows of goods. And I think 40% of our trade is passing through this area. So we need to also, for security reasons, we need to be better involved. And we are doing this, of course, with our main partners. And I think it's really an issue which is now growing in terms of interest for all member states. But this issue of who should come first was a very tricky issue when we finalized the adoption of the document, because the way you present it is, of course, always very sensitive.
Ms. Montgomery, can I ask you then, is there a sense, again, we're in the middle of a crisis, so obviously these kind of discussions are a bit further on, but the question basically of, the necessity for the United States to sort of balance between the two, and that kind of, is there a sense of, within Washington, that in the medium term we're going to have to push our allies to take more responsibility for their neighborhood while we focus further abroad? Or there isn't a sense that there's any necessity for that, and that'll be worked out on a piecemeal, ad hoc basis going forward?
Well, I think the current situation shows us that we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And what we're seeing is that, in fact, Russia and China are not two separate threats necessarily, divided by the wide geography that we would think when we talk about Europe and Asia. We're seeing China amplify Russian disinformation. We're seeing China support Russia economically, and that they have a partnership that has, quote unquote, no limits. And so I think what we are coming to understand, and I think we've come a very, very long way with the EU over the last year, is that these are both threats that we will both have to confront. And so we will be having, around the same time in Brussels as we're having the security and defense dialogue, we'll have the third iteration of our US-EU dialogue on China, and also the second iteration of our consultations on the Indo-Pacific. And I think that really just reflects that we recognize that these are both threats that we're going to have to work to manage together. And the EU is really an essential partner in our efforts on both Russia, obviously, but also on China.
So we have a question from Rasmus Hindren. It's a very broad question, but again, hopefully I can focus a little bit. It says, how are the reality of new conflicts, including cyber, hybrid, reflected in the strategic compass? That's a question for you, Ambassador Fries, but maybe the way to also ask that is maybe from the concept that you know, ahead of, before the Ukraine war kicked off, there was a lot of talk about the importance of you know, looking at global threats such as climate change, pandemics, and natural disasters also falling under the rubric of NATO. Is that also a means of maybe dividing and burden sharing, that you know, a partnership, an US-EU partnership over questions such as pandemics and crisis response might fit more with the EU bucket, and then other things would be more in the sort of NATO cooperation. So, Ambassador Fries, any thoughts on that?
The issue of should we share the work between NATO and the EU is a very old question and old issue, and I'm not sure that we should resolve this by specifying who should do what. I think it's good to maintain a certain degree of flexibility. But it's true that the EU is very much involved in now countering all kinds of hybrid threats, which can be cyber, but also, for instance, disinformation. And you have seen that a few weeks ago, the EU, for the first time, has stopped the broadcasting of Sputnik and Russia Today, because we consider that this disinformation was a tool in the hands of Putin's regime to distort the truth and to through this propaganda to disseminate wrong information and manipulate the public opinion. And so we want to be much more assertive in countering such malicious activities, and we have already done that. For instance, on cyber. We have what we call in our jargon, I'm sorry for this, a cyber diplomatic toolbox. We are very, we like in Brussels toolboxes. And so that means that we have already adopted sanctions against individuals or entities coming from Russia, from China, from North Korea, because we had the evidence that these people or entities had been involved in cyber activities at the expense of EU security interests. So with the compass, we are going to go further to see how we can strengthen this diplomatic toolbox, and we are thinking on the possibility. About the possibility to be much more, I would say, offensive in the kind of sanctions that could be taken. I don't want to prejudge the discussion with the member states, but I can tell you that we want to go beyond assets freezing and visa ban, travel bans, which is the current sanctions that we have adopted in the past for the entities and individuals I've just mentioned. So we would like to go much beyond, for instance, with trade sanctions, to be clear. And so cyber, disinformation, and also another example, we are going to put in place what we call hybrid rapid response teams. That means that we want to develop the possibility, to have the possibility to send very quickly teams of experts in order to help either member states, our CSDP missions and operations, which can be victim of disinformation, and we saw that in Central African Republic with our missions directly attacked by massive disinformation at the expense of the UN, but also of the EU. And third, we want also to have the possibility to send these teams of experts coming from Brussels or coming from member states to help to support our partners, and that's what we want. We want to do with Ukraine. We have a PESCO project led by Lithuania, precisely on cyber rapid response teams, and they are working. They are not on the ground, unfortunately, because of the invasion, but they are helping the Ukrainians in order to counter cyber attacks coming from Russia.
A follow-up on there that I think fits is I think there's mention of also but in passing at least, of fixing intelligence sharing on the EU level. Is that another priority? Because again, it seems one huge lesson from the Ukraine fight has been, above the cyber element of it, has been the really spectacular use of intelligence on the part of the United States and sharing with EU allies. Will there be attempts to get an EU-wide intelligence sharing agreements that are more robust and more comprehensive?
It's also an area where we want to do more by strengthening what we call our intelligence center. As I said, the threat analysis which was elaborated was also something historic, because that was the first time that there was an agreed document at the level of the intelligence community of the 27 member states. That was a consensus among the intelligence community, and it has been so well received by the member states that they have asked to do a new one before the end of the year. And of course, as a consequence of the crisis we have in Ukraine. So in terms of the intelligence community, the Compass also is a booster in this area.
And if I can just jump in,
Please.
I think you've made some really important points, Charles. And on the intel side, I would say we are sharing more with the EU than we ever have. And I think that's been a real success story, and we've seen that really pay dividends. But I would also just say that I think Ukraine is a really good example of why we have a lot of hand-wringing in sort of peacetime about what should the role of NATO and the EU be, and we try, I think, sometimes to our fault to over-define those relationships, because what we're seeing with Ukraine is that we have three main lines of effort in our policy. On two of them, on the unprecedented assistance that we in the EU are providing, both in the security field, but also the EU has really done remarkable things in terms of support for refugees, by, for the first time, initiating or activating its temporary protection directive. So that's a US-EU focus. On the sanctions side, obviously we have imposed massive and unprecedented sanctions in terms of both the scope and scale on Russia. Again, that's a US-EU effort. But then we also have the need to support our collective defense, and that is very much clearly in NATO's lane. And so I think it just demonstrates that we do have the ability to tackle problems from different sides. We all feel different parts of the elephant, as it were. And so our goal is really to strengthen all of those capabilities together. We've seen NATO and the EU take unprecedented actions at this time, and I think this is why this is a great moment for us to really look to build on those capabilities.
I mean, it's not really to press the point, because throughout this whole conversation, we're very much aware how much we're in the middle of things right now. But it is a question of how one institutionalizes it, because right now we're seeing unprecedented cooperation, unprecedented success, quite frankly, in cooperation. But it is a question of how do we get to a more permanent sort of relationship. And there is a question of how these things are parceled, even though they are difficult, right? I mean, is that misstating it?
No, I think that's part of why we have the security and defense dialogue.
Yeah.
It's part of why we're looking at how can we do more to institutionalize better NATO-EU cooperation. So there are definitely lessons that we'll learn from this, and I hope that we'll be able to sort of raise the floor in terms of what we can do together. There also, I think it's important to remember, and for those of you who are not EU experts, important to know that there are different, that member states, allies who are also EU member states, have, that the EU actually does have the competency in some of these areas. And so while NATO can do certain things on disinformation, for example, the EU also has competency in certain areas. And so there are also built-in sort of divisions of labor in some cases, depending on the issue.
If I may, in order to complement what Molly has just said, I think what we have seen since the invasion of Ukraine is a total political unity and complementarity between the EU and NATO. NATO, of course, has done a lot massively in order to reinforce a collective defense, and it's impressive to see now 100,000 US soldiers on European territory, and to have the reassurance tasks made by NATO. And on our side, the EU has done things that NATO is not doing. Sanctions, the sanctions are taken by the EU and a massive sanctions package. And second, it's true, the European Peace Facility, used for the first time to deliver lethal equipment, it's not NATO who can do that. Of course, after that, it's member states and allies who deliver concretely the weapons. But we have this 1 billion euros package, which is a historic decision, which was taken in one day. Never seen that before, and I think it surprised a lot of European commentators. Probably also it surprised positively, I hope, the US administration. And everything was done in full transparency and in very good coordination with the US. So we're during this famous weekend where we decided to de-SWIFT Russian banks, to stop the broadcasting of Russian propaganda channels, to adopt this massive military support to Ukraine. Everything was done also in good transparency and in full complementarity with our NATO allies. And we have established in Brussels a clearinghouse cell with our allies, and the US is involved in that. And it is very efficient because it can compare what the Ukrainian asks in terms of military equipment and what the member states can offer. And this clearinghouse cell, which is established within the EU military staff, so which is under the authority of Mr. Borrell, can validate, can clear all the requests presented by the member states. And after that, we have this 1 billion package, which serve in order to, which is used to reimburse the member states who have delivered the equipment to the Ukrainian army. And I can tell you, it's working very well and very fast. Very fast.
No, it's a huge success story. We're running out of time. I have one question from Jeffrey Pigman, which I think is it's somewhat provocative, but it's an interesting one. Probably not an easy answer to give, but let's just try. Says, can the EU, guided by the strategic compass, provide a security guarantee for Ukraine in any peace agreement, especially given the political toxicity of NATO? That is a tough question and probably unanswerable. But again, let me soften the question then a little bit. There is obviously, that's a big open question of what the status of Ukraine will be at the end of this. And there are actually built into the treaties security guarantees within the EU. Is that anywhere on the mind of Brussels as they contemplate the strategic compass, these kinds of things? Obviously, it's always been complementary with NATO and has worked that way. But as Europe develops more of a sense.
To be frank, this precise question has not been discussed with within the compass, but it's obvious that we need to offer new security guarantees to Ukraine. We had this Memorandum of Budapest of 1994, which obviously has not been respected by Russia. And so now, as soon as the war is over, we will need to think, or perhaps in the connection with the cessation of hostilities, we need to think what kind of guarantees could be offered to Ukraine. Something between more than Budapest, but of course less than Article 5, because Ukraine, we will see, but for the moment the situation is very difficult. So that's a question for the next weeks, which has to be addressed. We have also the huge impact of this crisis on the food situation, on the energy situation, and we have to say very clearly to the countries in Africa or in the Middle East who risk to suffer from this food insecurity or the energy prices. It's not the sanctions which are responsible for this. It's the war under the responsibility of Putin. So we need to coordinate it, to continue the outreach to all these countries who are going to suffer, and we need to support them. And there is a very important session next week at the World Food Programme in order to see what we can do. But to go back to your question about the security guarantees, it's a key issue, but the EU as such is not directly involved. That will be more for some stakeholders, but we need to see the list.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much to both of you. This has been an incredibly rich conversation. And thank you to all of us joining us on the internet. I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Europe Center and at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security for putting this together. Please follow us at AC Europe on Twitter for future events, and I really hope to see all of you soon. Thanks.